Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. I'm Michael Noland, and tonight the conclusion to the Beatles recording secrets, the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band sessions. Okay, so the next song up for recording at this point in the Pepper sessions was John Lennon's song, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Now, most of the lyrics in this song are based on a poster that John actually once bought in a shop. The song would offer an almost 18th century perspective to the album itself. Now, this is one of the few songs on the album that Paul actually plays bass on the rhythm track. Here we see in the initial recording sessions for the basic rhythm track, we have Paul on bass, Ringo on drums, John on a guide vocal, and George Martin on harmonium. Now, Emmerich in his book brings out they spent hours hammering away trying to get this basic rhythm track just right. By the end of the recording session for the rhythm track, George Martin was passed out on the floor, exhausted from having to pump the pedals for the harmonium the whole time. Now, as usual, John had ideas for the song, and as per usual, he was vague in what he wanted for it. It was at this point that he approached George Martin by saying that he wanted some kind of swirly music in there, by saying, I want the sound of a fairground around my voice. I want to be able to smell the sawdust and animals. I want to feel like I'm at the circus with Mr. Kite and the Hendersons and all of that. As often, that's about as far as John would get in his explanation. After some consideration, George Martin then considered that maybe the sound that John was looking for was that of a calliope. That, of course, being a very familiar sound to fairgrounds worldwide. There were even attempts at this point for EMI to procure one for a special recording session. But alas, no calliope was to be found. This is when Martin and Emmerich sent Richard Lush once again up to the audio library at EMI. He was instructed to pick out the very best calliope recordings they had. He brought the stack to George Martin and Jeff Emmerich. They listened and chose the very best pieces that they liked. Here, once again, they employed the same thing that they did with the recording of Yellow Submarine. If you recall, in our Revolver sessions video, there was a small part in Yellow Submarine that needed a solo. They had brought in recordings of Oompa bands, sliced them up into pieces, threw them in the air, put them back together once or twice, and got a brand new type of recording and free of future royalties. Here they chose to do that exactly again, but this time, instead of the smaller cuts of Yellow Submarine, they would allow 2 to 3 seconds to go by for each edit. As with Yellow Submarine, when they tossed these in the air and reapplied them, they found out they almost came out identical to the original recording. So once again, a quick switch of 2 of the pieces, and voila, a fairground. They would add further overdubs, such as chromatic organ overdubs, as well as glockenspiel, both recorded at half speed. Doing this, it would not affect what was pre-recorded up to that point, but only the instruments that they were recording on this pass. On top of that, John laid an Oompa-style organ track on top of all those overdubs as well. John then gathered George Harrison, Neil Aspinall, and Mal Evans, where they played a chorus of bass harmonicas. So it's easy to see with the amount of overdubs on this one track alone. Here's where we see the use of 2 4-tracks tethered again occasionally to help them free up tracks that a normal 4-track recorder couldn't do by itself. Next up, the song Lovely Rita. Now it's interesting, this is actually the first song where Paul actually decides to start using his bass guitar as an overdub instrument rather than as a bass part on the rhythm track itself. So after the basic tracks were complete, after all the Beatles left, Paul would work with Geoff Emerick, moving his bass amp out into the middle of the studio. This time, no close miking was involved. Geoff Emerick then took the microphone and placed it 6 feet away from the bass cabinet. He said this added the ambiance of Studio 2, the room sound, and that added an almost creamy sound to the bass. Now, it's here where Geoff Emerick says that as he starts to edit these down to reductions, that he starts to play the fader on the bass track, almost like an instrument itself. Many of the pieces being played for just this piece of the song or that piece of the song, and he wanted to make sure that the sound of the bass evolved around the changes in the recordings. And of course, it was this recording where he started doing exactly that. Now, it's for this reason that Emerick and many of the original engineers from the old days always recommend listening to the mono version of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And I have to say I agree. In my opinion, Sgt. Pepper still sounds quite three-dimensional, even in mono today. Now, Rita, as a song, was very similar to Penny Lane, or at least it was in Paul's head. It was on this song, for the first time since the recording of Penny Lane, he was insisting on a clear Beach Boy-like mix. Here, McCartney asks Martin specifically to help him arrange backing vocals so that they come off more Beach Boy sounding. Of course, he was still concerned about the clean sounds that he had achieved on Penny Lane and still wanted to achieve on this recording, and Emerick was behind the scenes making sure that was exactly what was happening. This song received many overdubs, including all 4 Beatles humming through their combs wrapped in EMI toilet paper. And that wonderful heavy breathing that you hear at the end of the song, that was just John one night looning around in front of Davy Jones of the Monkees, who had just come by to visit. And yet the Beatles decided to take that little happy accident and make it work in their favor as well. Now, it is noted that George spent hours trying to come up with an electric guitar solo that would fit the song. After a while, Paul McCartney decided he'd go ahead and add a piano solo. McCartney gave it a valiant try for a bit, eventually handing over the duties again to George Martin. So it's George Martin who plays that tacky honky-tonk solo on Lovely Rita. Now, it's interesting here. Emerick places the mic underneath the piano this time, and then he adds sticky tape to the rollers of the recording tape. This creates a mild warble. Now note, anything recorded prior to this is not affected. It's already on tape. But what's going on the tape now is being recorded at a warbling speed. This is what gives that honky-tonk sound to George Martin's solo. Some quick wit and a quick fix by a quick-thinking recording team, definitely. Of course, the next song up was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And you know, as complex as this song sounds, I've got to tell you, I was surprised to find out that the entire song was recorded in 3 nights. And that included rehearsals as well. Now, part of the reason for this is the Beatles had spent the better part of 5 months already in the recording studio. They had whiled away the winter months. Winter was giving away into spring, the weather was improving, and they were getting claustrophobic. Here in these recordings, the whole team encouraged John to give a more dreamy effect to his voice and his vocal delivery, and they achieve it superbly. Here, they again use the old trick of a Leslie speaker, but not on John's voice this time. This time, they decide to apply it to George Harrison's guitar. Again, just giving it that otherworldly feel. Now, if you remember in the previous videos, we had barely mentioned Good Morning, Good Morning. They had done the basic rhythm track and then shelved it up until this point. This night, they returned and worked entirely on John Lennon's lead vocal. It was around midnight that John Lennon finally nailed his vocal. Coming up into the control room, he then let Martin and Emerick know that he had been thinking of various animals chasing each other, the sound of animals chasing each other, to end as as an overdub for his song. He didn't like the way the basic track was just fading off. His idea was that each animal would either by nature chase or scare the next animal. But basically, John was saying the song just sounded too normal to his ears at this time. Once again, Richard Lush was sent up to search in EMI's library of sound effects. Back in the studio with an armful of them, George Martin and Geoff Emerick started discussing which animal sounds to use. They worked on this mix alone from midnight until dawn, and even then had no idea of the importance of the last animal's sound, the chicken clucking, had to the entire sound of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Good Morning is the one song on the album that received the most overdubs, heavily treated with a sweep oscillator and ADT to maintain the bright sound that the Beatles wanted to maintain at this point. And with Geoff Emerick writing the faders on Ringo's recorded toms, they accomplished a wonderful sound here. Now, it was at this point, finally, they turned their attention to George Harrison's composition. Not his original offering, but his second and one of his very best, the magnificent Within You, Without You. Now, when I first heard Sgt. Pepper, this was not my favorite track. But as the years ensued, I found that my position mellowed on this track, to the point that now when I listen to the album, this is the one track that really maintains side one and side two so well. Right at the very first recording session for this, Emerick throws down all these throw rugs onto the studio floor. With the studio floor at EMI being hardwood, he felt that it would absorb the sound of those instruments a little bit better. And of course, with close miking techniques, he was already showing that he could get a lot of sounds that nobody else had gotten before. George spent hours going over exactly what he wanted from these musicians. Now it's interesting here, Emerick says that George Harrison was at his most relaxed during the entire Sgt. Pepper sessions at these sessions, with the exception of Paul occasionally showing up, showing some interest in this process, to the point of either buying himself a sitar in the near future. The other Beatles didn't show a whole lot of interest in this song, or at least not at first. Eventually, Harrison decided on a drone of 3 to 4 instruments playing one note on top of each other. While they did this, Harrison and Neil Aspinall played the tambura on top of that. More and more instruments were laid over as Harrison continued to work closely with the Indian musicians there in the studio. Tabula was added, as well as Dilruba. All the while this was happening, the other 3 Beatles were already listening to a lot of the mixes that had already been done for the album. Now in the next recording session, both George Harrison and George Martin had to work closely together. Here it was decided they wanted an East meets West sound to the orchestration for his song. So here, once again, the basic track with the Indian musicians and an orchestra being recorded as an additional track, George Martin had to marry these two approaches. It's said that George Harrison and George Martin worked more closely on this song than they had ever recorded, nor would they ever spend together recording a song for the Beatles in total. And boy, was it worth it. Both the West cultural influences as well as the Eastern influences are clearly heard at once, creating an almost three-dimensional view of the song itself, with Martin mastering the tonal differences between East instruments and West instruments, and George Harrison later laying down his sitar parts, and the audacity of George Harrison actually requesting that a laugh track be added to the very end of this very somber piece only makes it a masterpiece, in my opinion. The Beatles now turn their attention to McCartney's She's Leaving Home. Like I said before, the Beatles were getting antsy at this point. They didn't like waiting around. They wanted to get things done. It was time to start tying up this album. McCartney had some vague ideas for a string arrangement. George Martin wasn't available that day, so he hired Mike Leone Leander to help him with the string arrangement. When they brought the song in for recording, evidently there was some bad blood between Martin and McCartney, or at least temporarily speaking. For the entire recording session, Martin stayed downstairs in the studio conducting Mike Leander's arrangement, with McCartney upstairs in the control room, keeping out of his way. The following week, they would return to the song, adding John and Paul's vocals. There were only 2 tracks left at this point, and he wanted both his and John's vocals to be doubled. This required them to sing nose to nose, sitting on high stools with all lights except for a back table lamp lit, going over and over and over until they had the perfect sound that McCartney was hearing in his head. Next up to be recorded, With a Little Help from My Friends, a song that Lennon and McCartney wrote for Ringo's one vocal contribution to the album. Originally entitled Badfinger Boogie, With a Little Help from My Friends took 10 takes to complete and perfect. Knackered after the hours it took for them to achieve this, Ringo started to head out the door. That's when John, Paul, and George said, "Hey, Ringo, where are you going?" And that's when Ringo was to find out that he was expected to not only remain, but to record his lead vocal for this song. With all 4 Beatles wrapped around the mic, encouraging Ringo to get it right, especially for that one resounding note at the end, Ringo finally pulled off the lead vocal. After all of this, John and Paul would then quickly add their backing vocals to this song. Once again, McCartney was on piano for these basic tracks. He would add his bass later, as usual, and George would later add his guitar piece. It's interesting for this track, Paul actually did not record his bass down in the studio. He recorded it in the control room with a long cord extending down to his bass cabinet in the studio. He wanted more eye-to-eye direct contact with Emmerich as they placed each note right where it should be. With only one more track to be recorded, they set off to record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band Reprise. Now, because of short notice, they could not book Studio 2, their usual recording studio. Here they had to record in the cavernous Studio number 1 at EMI. Emmerich put together a hut of baffles in the center of the room, placed the Beatles right on top of each other, and recorded them up close, with the sound of the room being the only delay that you hear. No further echo, no further delay was added to these recordings. A brilliant placement of mics, sound baffles, and a larger space without, as well as one of the tightest performances the Beatles ever pulled off in one take, and the entire process started and recorded in one single session. Now it was time to put it all together. The recording team at this point spent the next 2 weeks deciding the running order of the songs on the album. One thing they had committed to, there would be no 2 to 3 second gap between songs like on most pop albums. Songs would either be cross-faded into each other or deliberately run right into each other. Now this whole process has been done to death many times since then, but at the time it had never been done before. Now it's interesting here, songs running into each other even needed some crossfading. Gone were the long, shallow crossfades, of course. But happy stances prevailed yet once more. Remember that clucking chicken at the end of Good Morning, Good Morning? Run that baby right up against Paul counting off for Sgt. Pepper Reprise, and you've got an amazing sound. The 2 songs instead sounding like they were the very same recording session, the same song, just part 1 and part 2. And that cluck the chicken makes, the tonality of it was perfect. It matched up perfect with George Harrison's guitar. Emmerich even saying that he was afraid he'd have to apply Verispeed on that cluck alone. At the time, very minute editing indeed. But again, luck and happenstance happened to prevail in the Beatles' favor. Now, it was at this point, after a couple of weeks, that Martin and Emmerich agreed that when they went to master these master tapes, they wanted no further EQing done, with George Martin even having the audacity to request Harry Moss, EMI's senior mastering engineer, to do it, and to add no further EQing. Well, this really hacked off Horace Hack, and he was livid. This was just never asked. Now, mastering in itself is an entirely different art. Emmerich himself says the time he spent in the mastering room were some of his fondest memories, other than being pulled away from the Beatles and their recording sessions. Well, despite Mr. Hack's objections, George Martin got what he wanted from the upper levels of EMI. They at least allowed Geoff Emerick to attend the mastering sessions, since he had been a mastering engineer himself in the past. And Geoff Emerick does admit to adding a bit of EQ here once he got into the mastering room, but for the most part left it bare. Now, I feel that bare sound is what separates Sgt. Pepper's from every single Beatle album apart from it. Whether this was accomplished by adding very little EQ to the mastering process or by a plethora of other things we've discussed in these last 5 videos, the sound achieved for Sgt. Pepper is indeed its own alone. Unlike the marvelous Revolver album, where everything was played backwards, there are relatively very few things played backwards on this album. While other groups were currently, while the Beatles were at these recording sessions trying to match Revolver, the Beatles were already overmatching what they had accomplished on that album. To the Beatles, simple backwards effects were already old hat, utilized at best at this point in their career, very sparingly. You know, it's interesting. Both albums were recorded with the same recording equipment, the same instruments basically. But at this point, the Beatles were looking for tonalities. And that's the major change of sound that we hear between these two wonderful albums. Relying less on special effects and exploring these new tonalities, Sgt. Pepper is, like its front cover, a multitude of a colorful soundscape exploding about your ears. Now, of course, the Pepper sessions were recorded mainly in Studio 2 instead of Studio 3, as in Revolver, and that has a bit to do with the sound differences as well. Despite 4-track to 4-track transfers, the most transfers ever used on this album were 3, with McCartney and Emmerich and Martin all maintaining this high fidelity sound, enriching the lows, increasing the highs, and making everything just brighter. What they accomplished on 4-track is mythical, matching, and yes, even surpassing by some people's estimations, the magnificent Abbey Road, and done on a lot fewer tracks, by the way. This album usually stands out as the pinnacle of the Beatles' career. While I don't totally buy that aspect, it is a true highlight and a major move forward for pop music in general. To say that Sgt. Pepper took the public by surprise would be an understatement. All of the articles talking about the Beatles leading up to the release of Sgt. Pepper were either rumors of them breaking up or of concerns that their artistic well had dried. McCartney has been quoted many times as saying he just felt like just you wait. Just You Wait. Recorded in just under 6 months, a massive amount of time back in 1967 for a pop album. Many people from the 60s will tell you that the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album was the soundtrack for the Summer of Love. And I was raised in the Bay Area and spent time in the city in those days, and the album sure seemed to me to be the soundtrack of the year. With the release of this album, the question was, what can't the Beatles accomplish at this point in their career? So that about wraps up our series on the Beatle recording secrets, the Sgt. Pepper sessions. If you got anything out of the content, please give us a thumbs up and consider hitting subscribe to the tribe. Just hit that top bell notification and you'll be notified of all future videos. This is The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland, and we'll see you in the next video.